This is the Mixed Martial Arts Beat for the third week of January 2014. Hello again, everyone. I'm Ariel Helwani inside our New York City studio. Today I'm being joined by Mike Chiappetta of FoxSports.com, Jeff Wagenheim of Sports Illustrated, and of course the man with the hat, Chuck Mindenhall. He is of MMA Fighting.com as well. All right, guys, a lot to talk about this week on the show. Let's start with the big one, GSP versus the UFC. Who would have thought this was coming? But just a couple of days ago, GSP speaking to some French reporters in Montreal, blasting the UFC for not standing by him when he was trying to get Johnny Hendricks to go with VADA for their drug testing prior to UFC 167, and also calling the UFC a monopoly. Not what we've heard from GSP in the past. He's been very guarded throughout his career. First, let's just talk about what GSP had to say, and then we'll get to Dana White and Lorenzo Fertitta's response. Are you surprised that he's talking this way a month after vacating the title?
I'm a little bit surprised just because, as you said, George has been so guarded, so private in his career. And there's been times where he's wanted to say things and he's kind of told us to sort of read between the lines and whatnot. But at the same time, I mean, this has kind of been brewing for a little while. Dana White, during the post-fight press conference, said that, it was really George's first time talking about this, but that's not really true. Mm-hmm. If you rewatch or look at the coverage of UFC 158 when he fought Nick Diaz, he said immediately right after that he wanted to kind of bring in Olympic-style testing because he had his name dragged through the mud one too many times. And as George says, he starts obsessing over things. And I think that maybe Nick Diaz saying he's on, I think, plenty of steroids was his term he used at the time, maybe it was something that got in GSP's head and stayed there, and it was maybe the breaking point for him. And going forward, he was consistent that he did want to bring in VADA. Unfortunately, he couldn't get Johnny Hendricks to agree with him, but he still went through the testing on his own. And when Dana says that he didn't agree to do the Nevada enhanced testing, that's not necessarily true. As we saw with the email chain that Bloody Elbow did a great job obtaining, his camp sort of was asking for some information, and at some point Keith Kizer was like, I'm just going to take this as a no and kind of cut it off. So George has wanted to do this. Unfortunately, we end up in this situation where, as Dana said, the camps can never agree, and that's a big problem. And that is where, in a sense, he's right that they did sort of look bad, where they're going through this in the public and not able to come to a amicable resolution and do the right thing for both sides. But for George, it was sort of always coming to this, and now that he can sort of found his voice, I guess I don't expect it to stop. I think he's going to continue pushing this as an issue.
Do you agree with him, Jeff? Do you think that GSP is going to keep going with this? Because to me, a lot of guys bring up stuff when they leave the UFC, but then they always stop short at actually trying to change things. Do you see GSP actually trying to change the sport, or at this point he's saying, all right, if I can't change it like I tried to, I'm done with the sport, I'm not coming back?
Well, the fact that he did this, a month and a half after his fight, this was not something that just came out in the heat of the moment, in the direct aftermath of the fight. But I think in some ways it grew out of the heat of the moment, not so much his heat, but Dana White's heat. George has always been the kind of the quiet company man, and he's always sort of supported the UFC, even if he's said some of the things that Mike suggests. He's always said it in a kind of quiet way. But then in the aftermath of his last fight, not so much Dana White saying that he thought that Johnny Hendricks won the fight. That's that happens all the time. People disagree with how a fight is scored. But his whole thing about, well, he's not leaving. He can't leave. He has to defend the belt. His kind of blasting of George in the aftermath of that, and not supporting him and supporting his decision, I think that has something that has lingered with St-Pierre. And so now he's realizing that he's not a company man anymore. And so he's going to go with what his gut tells him to do it. I don't know whether that's going to mean he's going to become a champion for this cause in the long term, but I don't think he's going to hold back and quietly go away the way some of us thought he might have.
Part of the thing that's weird about this is that you can sense that the UFC is finding out about things as we are. It's almost like there's no communication behind the scenes. And you can tell that's what rankles with Dana White and even probably Lorenzo Fertitta, is that a lot of this stuff that are used to a Georges St-Pierre being a consummate professional for so long, being the guy who is just always going to do the right thing, is going to be the face of an organization, show that it's not barbaric, it's skill, it's all those things that he was a lot of things to the UFC. For him to come out and actually do this, I think it's kind of catching him off guard a little bit, especially this last thing, because it was similar to when he made the vague announcement that he might retire after the fight. That caught Dana White off guard. Even though I remember you were asking him constantly, and he's like, I don't know anything about it. So there was whisperings in the air, obviously, that might happen. But Dana probably didn't, know it was going to happen until it happened. But this particular time, it just seemed like, to me, it caught those guys off guard, and he wanted to talk about it, to almost sort it through. And he makes some good points. It's funny when you heard Dana White's version a couple nights back after the Atlanta show. He basically, pointed out that, hey, we busted Mark Hunt, Bigfoot Silva after the Mark Hunt, and I was the guy who was doing this, which is a good point to that. To counter that.
Here's the difference. Dana was running down everything that they have done, and let's be honest, they have done a lot in the last year or so. They test guys when they get signed. They're testing the entire card when they're the regulators. They've done some, and they've changed over the years, so they should be commended for that. But I think what bothers GSP the most is that they didn't stand by him. And not only did they not stand by him, Dana said that they look stupid, both GSP and Hendricks, for going back and forth.
Absolutely.
Now, and I think that, at the end of the day, is what bothers GSP the most, that he can have his issues about what they're doing, what they're not doing. I think, and the impression I get from talking to people is that he wanted them to at least publicly stand beside him and say, this is the right thing to do.
He literally was, the one thing he was saying ahead of UFC 167 is he's doing this for the sport. He loves the sport. He wanted the sport to change. It was almost like he had a bigger picture in mind. He wanted his name clear. He was tired of all that stuff. And can you imagine having that relationship for so long and being a vital piece, and your employer at that point says, that's stupid, you guys look stupid, it's almost childish, it's unnecessary, they do the testing, this is all, you know what I'm saying?
And let's not forget, he said this before the fight as well. Remember that article in the press in Montreal? He said he felt very bothered by this, he was disappointed. So, he's been honest about it, he's been telling us how he's feeling, and I think it really is all rooted in that.
I think we might have to distinguish a little bit when Dana was talking about, them looking stupid. He might have been talking about them, doing it publicly, kind of going back and forth and trying to come to an agreement, and not, right? So
that could be what bothered GSP, or maybe he misunderstood because of the language.
It could be, but I think Dana never really clarified that until after the Atlanta show, which could be revisionist. I don't know. It's hard to know what was in his head at the time. But I think the larger point here is that this is a good thing for MMA. It's uncomfortable for the UFC for sure to have the guy who's the biggest star in mixed martial arts talking about this issue, but in the end, it's going to be a good thing for MMA because, as you're pointing out, they've done some good things as far as increasing testing. A lot of people would say, most people would say, they haven't done enough. They could do more, particularly random testing, out of competition testing, which they'll always say falls under the government. When we're regulated by the government, yes, you are, but you can still do more as a private company. You can test guys out of competition. You can make them sign contracts to say you're going to be open to this testing at random times.
Right, random is the big word.
Word.
Scheduled is a lot different. Only the densest people are going to get busted, when they're doing something in a scheduled urine test or something.
Yeah, because when they test them, like say in Australia, that's what's so crazy about the Bigfoot thing. They know when they're getting tested.
Exactly. And that's what VADA did. They can, when you sign up with them, they have to know your schedule, what's going to be for that entire 8 weeks. And they could show up on your doorstep, they could show up at your gym, they could show up when you're at the restaurant having dinner. And so that is completely random, unannounced testing. And the tests that they use too, the carbon isotope ratio test, much more sophisticated, much better to catch a wider array of performance enhancing drugs. And
like
those are things. That's part of this too. It's not just, it's not just to prove that GSP is clean, it's to help clean up the sport. And we all know there's always going to be cheaters trying to get ahead of this testing, whatever it is, as advanced as it is. As we saw with Alex Rodriguez just this past week, he was beating tests after, up until 2011, 2012 apparently, and other Major League Baseball guys were too. And we all felt that Major League Baseball and other sports had testing that was far superior to what we see in MMA. There's still guys beating tests, and there always will be. But you have to do what you can to try and catch up.
But who is threatened by enhanced testing? The fighters who are cheating, on the one hand, but also the fight promotion in some respects, because the bottom line gets affected. If some fighter,
as GSP pointed out,
right, so the bottom line gets affected, and this is where that whole conflict of interest comes up. And I know that I've mentioned it many times on the show, and others have as well. Dana White is the president of the UFC. He's also the de facto commissioner of MMA, the UFC being the largest and by far the largest organization doing MMA. And so what's good for MMA is not always good for the UFC, at least in their short-term, let's get this fight going view. So it's only natural that Dana White would come out and try to poo-poo anything that GSP says. And for those of us who listen to that, we have to view it through that lens. This is a guy who's a businessman. He's not the commissioner of the sport. He's not the guy who's overseeing it and trying to make everything better. He's the guy that's trying to put more people in the seats at the arena, get more people to buy the pay-per-views. And in order to do that, he needs as many big stars as he can to present to people, even if some of them might be bending the rules a little bit.
If you're going to have a crusader, and there's going to be a crusader for this effort, who would be better than GSP,
Exactly.
who is a guy who's probably the biggest profile guy to do it? You're in a day and age where it's actually being scrutinized more and more and more. This is with even with the athletic commissions and everything else, and through Dana White, the UFC, everything. If you're going to have a guy who's going to put on a crusade, I would like it to be a guy like GSP, because then it'll actually, maybe there will be a change if he's taking a stance, especially since he's a big piece of that puzzle. One thing, as I remember, I think it was on your show, the MMA Hour, you talked to Krzysztof Szczecinski one time, and I remember him throwing out, I think it was him, he threw out like this ridiculous percentage of people he thought were on PEDs of some kind, and it was like a ridiculous percentage. At the time, I remember thinking it was a little bit out there. But if you've talked to insiders and you've talked to other fighters and stuff, you get similar numbers all the time. And so you feel like it is a problem. That he's mentioned, what he's talking about, there is a problem. And maybe maybe it is good that somebody's actually bringing more awareness to it, if nothing else.
It is good. Having George as a crusader, as you said, I mean, a high-profile guy. It will be more impactful if it was someone that was active. Like, I'd love to see someone like Chris Weidman or somebody like that pick up the torch.
Weidman's not doing that, not at this stage.
I'm just saying, I mean, to have an active fighter, preferably a
Like
champion, somebody who, even if they don't like his message, there's not much they can say about it. He's going to get fights. He's going to be in the headlines.
But
all this
who has
stuff.
more clout than GSP? And you know what
He
makes
does
this
have a
so
lot of clout,
interesting?
but it would have been more impactful if he had done this actively and this loudly as a champion.
But here's the thing about GSP. GSP, in the past, has never been one to ruffle feathers, and I think that's why this is so impactful. He's not like a Rampage Jackson who's been complaining his entire career about all kinds of things. GSP never complained about anything. So now he's complaining, now he's bringing up points, people are listening. And also what makes this so interesting is there's an awkward position here for both sides. GSP has one foot out the door. He says, I might come back, I might not come back. The UFC wants him to come back. So they can't go out and be like, screw you, you're an idiot, you're never, da-da-da-da-da-da-da.
You notice they're both like citing to the side of cordial still.
It's a very awkward spot for everyone involved. GSP, I think, is fine if he never fights again. But the UFC wants him back. They need him back. He's a huge star. He's a megastar. So they can't blast him. They don't want to blast him. They've had a good relationship with him. And I think that's what makes this so interesting. He's not Randy Couture in Bellator, and he's never coming back. He's GSP with one foot out the door, who they want to bring 2 feet back in the door.
I mean, some people look at it like they blast him, though, right? I mean, I don't think that's.
I don't think that was a blasting.
When you go back to Dana's post-fight press conference quotes about him needing to like man up and defend the title and all this stuff, and call me on the phone or talk to me face to face like a man. All this. Some people would say that's blasting.
For Dana White, though, we've seen worse.
If there are repercussions to do, like there's an active fighter like we were talking about, there's an active fighter to do it, and there are repercussions for doing that, people are not going to do it. You know what I mean? It's like, that's where the monopoly thing comes in, because I feel like that was his point. He's not really saying that there's only one, or I didn't feel like he was saying there's only one, because there's nothing else out there. I thought he was saying, like, you can't talk about it because guys are afraid. And you've heard this from other people who walk out, they get out of the sport and they start to talk after the fact because there's no more consequence for them.
That's a great point.
There's been so many guys who've talked about wanting increased testing and I mean,
but not GSP.
Not GSP, but I'm saying when they say guys are afraid to talk, there are certain things fighters are afraid to talk about. Okay, I grant that, but there have been so many fighters who have talked about wanting to increase testing, guys who have come out and said they're anti-TRT. There's been tons of guys.
But when GSP says
are they really that afraid to talk about it?
When GSP says it, it becomes national news in Canada. Like when Rampage or Randy Couture,
big news here. It wasn't the front page of MSN.
And absolutely, but this is something that Okay, MSN has that relationship with Fox Sports, so we know that but this is like on CBC News. This is on like the national news. This would be, this is a massive deal in Canada.
So 12 or 13 Canadians are outraged?
Yeah. the point is that this guy transcends MMA, and especially up north, and that's a big market for them. They don't want those kinds of headlines about GSP, and I think it's a very interesting spot. I just am curious even if he doesn't do anything, could this mean really the end of GSP in the UFC? Could it get worse?
He also remember, did not just tackle the topic of PEDs,
Exactly.
but he also tackled the UFC specifically.
And
that's something.
those are damning comments.
When we first started this discussion, you were talking about some of the things that the UFC has done to try to make things a little bit better, but they really haven't gone far enough. And this was an example of somebody calling them out. It wasn't just saying, there shouldn't be TRT. We've heard Dana White say that, but has he done anything to really to change
Seems
that?
like he backed off on that a little bit, right?
Yes, yeah, it seems
But
that way.
as you mentioned, the monopoly comment is a huge comment, saying guys are afraid. This is the LeBron James, the Michael Jordan of the sport, saying that. You have to listen to him. Now, to me, the most interesting part to try to spin this forward is, where does he go from here? Where does everyone go from here? Where does GSP, most importantly, go from here in the sense that, what does he keep doing? He does, it's funny. He's essentially retired. He's on a break right now. He's more honest, talking more now. When did you ever hear from GSP in between fights, holding press conferences and all this kind of stuff? To watch him, he has become, all of a sudden, arguably, at one time he was like the most vanilla interview in the sport. He's become the most interesting interview in the sport. I mean, I would cut off my leg to talk to GSP today. Don't you want to hear what he has to say?
I'd love to make that happen.
Yeah,
Don't you want to hear what this guy has to say? I mean,
Well,
I was sitting there transcribing a 50-minute French interview. I haven't done that since I was in grade 7 to English. I mean, and I couldn't get enough of it. He's just a very interesting guy right now.
But again, he was, he felt like he got a slap in the face by the guy to whom he had been very faithful for all this time. And when that happens, suddenly all the things that you might want to say, or you might say in a kind of couching way, you're just going to go out and say it. And so, is he going to carry this along? Is he going to be the crusader in the long term? Is he going to enlist some active fighters to join him in that? We talked about some of the active fighters who might be interested. A lot of active fighters really respect Georges St-Pierre, and maybe if he says, "Hey, let's get on board and do this," maybe he can enlist 3 or 4 of the champions.
Well, here's something very interesting to note. How many fighters do you hear in the last 48, 72 hours saying, "Hey, I agree with that guy"? I haven't heard one.
Yeah.
Have you heard one publicly on Twitter? Hey, kudos to you, GSP, for what you're saying about drug testing and other stuff. You don't hear one. Why is
Good
that?
point.
Why is that?
We can't talk about it actually.
So final word on this.
Listen, obviously the situation right now is teetering on radioactive, so I can understand why the fighters are
Even
silent
guys who
about
are
it.
not in the UFC.
Well, that's a little weird.
Right?
That's what I mean. They certainly can. I mean, unless they too are thinking about their future prospects. But again, I mean, in the past,
You don't even hear the Frank Shamrocks of the world. You know what I mean? You'd
Yeah.
expect it from.
Yeah, somebody would just keep
I don't know.
on,
It's strange.
There are
I don't know what
people-
to attribute that to. But there, again, we've had so many guys come out as saying they're against TRT, saying they want increased drug testing, saying bring in VADA and all this stuff. So it's not like it's never happened. It's just that the situation now has reached kind of a little bit of a boiling point, and I think people are maybe curious to see what happens next. For George, I mean, who knows? I mean, he's in a situation, like you said, he doesn't really need to fight again. He doesn't really need the UFC. He can have this platform whenever he wants. Whenever he wants to talk to MMA media. If he calls you today, he'll probably leave the studio right now if your phone rings.
The thing
With
is-
all
sawing his leg off, right?
Yeah, exactly.
The thing is out there, though. It's like the thing is it pervades sort of the sport. Luke Rockhold in his on Wednesday night when he talked in his post-fight, he mentions Vitor, but he wants him in the States. It's like that's the sort of underlying thing that's happening with this drug. That's what I'm saying. So the GSP is doing it. Maybe people aren't saying it, but a lot of people are thinking what he's talking about.
Dana White said that he thinks GSP's feelings are hurt, that what he said after the fight really bothered him. I think GSP's feelings are hurt, but not so much about what he said in that press conference, about what he didn't do leading up to the fight. And it's going to be interesting to see how they repair the relationship. Guys, let's move on. Of course, 2014, no GSP right now, no Anderson Silva, but how about this? Who would have predicted that Anderson might return to the UFC before GSP ever does? He's saying that he wants to come back. He's doing interviews. His management is doing interviews, and they're saying he's coming back. He started physical therapy this week. He's coming back. That's his focus. He's not going out like this. Does this surprise you?
Not at all. Not at all. I mean, I think this was probably to be expected. The second he was carried off on a stretcher, champions don't want to go out in that way. They don't want that to be the last memory that the sporting public has of them. You had all these great moments, and that's how we remember them walking out. It's the same thing Mariano Rivera with the Yankees when he tore his ACL and said he literally said, I mean, that's not the way, I can't go out that way. I have to come back and do. It's the same thing. All greats want to have that last moment of glory. I'm sure he still feels like he's a viable contender even though he's lost Chris Weidman twice. And listen, I'm not going to disagree with him. I think there are still many guys in the UFC middleweight division he could beat. So I'm not surprised at all.
Do you think it's smart for him to come back? He will be almost 40 years old.
You know, his doctor went through many years of medical school to form an opinion, and I have
How
gone
many did
through
you go
zero.
through?
I went through 0 years of medical school. In fact, didn't even go to class.
That's not going to stop you.
But,
Come on.
but nonetheless, I'll still give you an opinion. The way I look at it is, he broke his leg. One of his great weapons are his leg kicks. That tells me that this is going to really take away a significant part of his offensive arsenal. And so
he does have a rod in that leg now, so maybe that helps
well,
him.
yeah, so maybe that makes it better. But Anderson Silva, you know, was by far the most exhilarating, exciting fighter we could see out there. And so this one thing that's going to lessen his ability is, you know, he's got a lot of other weapons that he can use. So if he comes back, he's going to probably have to be a little bit of a different fighter. And, you know, Mike says there's some guys out there in middleweight division that he can still beat. Well, I think there's probably almost everybody he can still beat. Is it smart for him to do it? I don't know. I mean, I think that he certainly wants to do it now, and this is a time where you don't want to be remembered for being carried out there. But he'll know when he gets back in the gym and he starts to try to do the things he used to be able to do. And if he can still do them, he's going to schedule a fight. And if he schedules the right fight, he'll probably do okay. If he schedules the wrong fight, well, it could be could be a set.
Roy Jones is the smart fight.
I think it's yeah.
If he can't kick, that'd be a good one. Yeah.
I think it's funny that there were times in his career where he'd be done with the fight, and there would be this sort of coming out of his camp, this obfuscation that maybe he might want to retire, like he was done. And now here we are, you know, he gets a gruesome injury, and immediately within a week he's coming back. You know, it's funny how his camp is very good at just setting the table the way they want it. I do believe he'll come back because the exact same thing that Mike said. Going out that way, it's just not. You know, he just signed the contract to go out that way. There didn't have an ounce of finality to it in terms of from a viewership point of view as well. It just. You know that he'll want to come back as a competitor. I wonder, though, about his mental state and his physical state then coming into play as soon as he's able to, because it's going to take a toll on himself, just, you know, being able to stay in shape for the next 6 months and to get back slowly to where he was. And we may have been seeing already a diminished Anderson Silva in there these last couple times as well. You just don't know that until you see him, and his chin does seem a little bit more vulnerable, all that stuff. So. Is it smart or any of that stuff? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. I mean, I guess we'll find out. But ultimately, I think he does it.
He's earned the right to say goodbye the way he wants to anyways.
Yeah.
I mean, I agree with it. The chin probably a little bit diminished, as we've seen both fights with Chris Weidman. Chris Weidman's a beast, but still, I think that will be sort of a factor going forward. But yes, I mean, I think when you reach that level, you're an all-time great. You get to walk out the way you want to.
Kong Lee is who you should fight next.
Hey, Gus Johnson was campaigning for that many moons
that's
ago.
right.
You know,
He wants to fight Georges St-Pierre, though, right?
Well, yeah, I don't know if that's happening. On Globo in Brazil on Sunday, he did this interview, and a lot of people were upset that he was kind of taking away something from Weidman, saying that he didn't really win, and it was, you know, this injury that happened. Had he not been injured, he would have won the fight eventually. I mean, were you bothered at all? Was this, you know, unsportsmanlike from Anderson Silva?
When's the last time that a fighter watched the other guy get his hand raised and didn't think that he won the fight? It just, you know, it always happens. It's just a common thing amongst fighters. Even if there are, you know, sometimes a fighter will say, well, you know, he was the better man tonight. Or so there's very seldom a time. I don't know if I've ever heard a fighter who said, well, this guy's just way better than me. And so, you know, I understand that the fight ended in a you know, what some of us would call a fluky way. We know that Weidman did train to check kicks and yada yada yada, but it did end in a bizarre way. So I understand where he's coming from. He has come from behind to win fights before. I thought that Weidman had built a gap on him and the gap was only going to widen. I thought that the longer the fight went, the worse it was going to be for Anderson. But I'm not Anderson Silva. That's, you know, and he's a guy that's the way he thinks, and he's a champion for thinking that way. So no, it didn't bother me. That's just the way a guy who's had a lot of success is going to think.
But if I'm Chris Weidman, I could
Sure.
that would definitely bother me, right? I mean, if I went out and earned it, I put in all the time, that training camp, cut weight, all this stuff. Went out there, knocked the guy down in the first round, dominated him on the ground for the first round,
His camp was
almost finished him.
They were bothered by that.
He deserves a right to be
He won
bothered
all
by
4
that.
rounds.
Exactly. He won all 4 rounds. He was never in trouble for 4 rounds against Anderson Silva. He won 4 rounds. He knocked him down once. He knocked him out once. I mean, he's like, what else do I have to do?
But who was the guy that Weidman beat before Silva? It was
Mark Munoz.
And I've heard Munoz,
Yeah.
even after losing
Sure.
his next fight,
Yeah.
still talking about how he wants that shot at Weidman when he's in a better shape. So it's just it's just the way it is.
There's like a little detachment from reality that fighters have to have. I mean, you have to when you go in and you get to that level, you have to believe that you're the best guy in the world. Otherwise, if you go in with a lack of confidence, I mean, where are you once the fight begins? You're gonna be lost
look
in
at
your own
Josh
head.
Barnett. Just on Monday, he didn't throw around many compliments towards Travis Brown. Was talking about all the things that he was going through leading up to the fight and in the cage. Yeah, and I mean, you expect that from fighters. Was just curious to get your take on it. Okay, let's move on and let's switch gears and talk about Bellator because they've gotten some negative press this week, and it's coming from one of their fighters. Patricio Pitbull won their Season 9 lightweight tournament. He thought he was going to face, featherweight tournament. He thought he was going to face the winner of Daniel Strauss versus Pat Curran 2 that happened in November. They come out this week and announce we're getting a third fight between them. The second fight was very one-sided. No one was clamoring for the third fight, but they're doing it anyway in March. Patricio, not happy at all, calling them out, saying, title shots earned, all that stuff, it's all BS. And now Bellator looks bad. They put in this clause saying that if there's a great fight, they'll do it again, but that wasn't a great fight. So why are they doing it again? What does Bellator do now? I mean, do they just scrap? Is the tournament holding them back? Are they just going to continue to look hypocritical here by doing what they want? I mean, how do they handle a situation like this? Because it's going to come up in the future as well.
By the way, Daniel Strauss is not really happy with this either, right?
Exactly.
I mean, even a guy in the title fight is looking at it the same way.
Because he knows they wouldn't have done that for him had he lost.
And didn't they have 2 tournament winners that were sort of waiting?
There's another guy who has visa issues. But still, yes, there's a logjam. And there's also one at lightweight as well, but no one's really upset about them giving the Alvarez Chandler fight a third go round.
Listen, maybe you should be from the school here where all the publicity is good publicity.
Maybe
their names are in the MMA press, right? People are talking about it. People are interested in it for whatever reason. I don't know if that will translate to viewers or not, but
it won't. It won't.
Okay. Well, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if there's a solution. I mean, they've kind of pigeonholed themselves into this tournament thing. They've made a couple concessions to say, okay, if such and such happens, we can push someone to the front of the line. If the challenger gets injured, we can put somebody else in. They've tried to give themselves a little bit of wiggle room, but for the most part, they're still going by the tournament. So I don't know. I mean, Bjorn from the beginning always said, this is who we are and what we are,
and I will never change. From a couple years ago,
so
it's amazing.
He's kind of pigeonholed himself, and I think by and large they're okay with it. They're happy with it because now they have this situation where they can change things if they need to. So if it ain't broke, don't fix it. I don't know.
But it's broke. Because, I mean, the
Is it
brackets
broke?
are
I mean,
broke. If you're telling people, like, hey, you're going to enter this 8-man tournament, we're going to modify the rules. You can't because we don't have superficial wounds. We're going to do all this. We're going to do all this stuff because you're going to get a shot at, as you go through it. But it has no meaning ultimately. Then it becomes broken just in itself. Just the whole thing is broke.
Who's it broke to though? Is it broke to the fans or to the promotion?
And also the fighter,
because
if you tell the fighter
to do what they want
it
now,
perpetuates indifference, and that's the whole thing. Like, people are never going to get behind it if it's just whimsical in the end. If it's just going to be whimsical in the end, either you steadfastly stick to a tournament format or you don't. And we've been talking about this for a long time, all of us on the show, about maybe they should just do away with the tournament at this point.
They should.
And just go into how they want to book these fights, because you get rid of the controversy that way.
I like the idea of a tournament because I like the idea of a meritocracy. I like that people, what their catchphrase where title shots are earned. I think that's I know it's just a catchphrase, but I actually like it because we've seen in the UFC where guys.
But it's not true anymore, right?
Well, now it isn't.
Right.
But the idea was, okay, you have to go through this tournament, then you get a shot. And then they said, okay, we'll relax these rules because every once in a while things happen where champions get a little disgruntled because they're sitting on the shelf waiting for the tournaments to end. So we'll have a new, sort of a side way of getting a title shot. And that's fine to have another way of doing it. But then to have a tournament winner sitting there healthy and waiting, and your champion sitting there healthy and waiting, and to still not make that fight, it doesn't make any sense.
Particularly in this case. Patricio Freire has beaten Daniel Strauss.
Right.
He had a year and a half off, loses a split decision to Pat Curran.
Yeah.
So, and then he wins. Goes and wins the next tournament. I mean, he has every single ingredient that you'd want to put him back into a title fight. So, if anybody's going to have a stink about it, make the point of it would be him.
And they do Curran no favors as well, because now people are mad at Curran.
Right.
Of course, he's going to take the title shot. If he wins, they're going to be like, you didn't deserve it. That's kind of one of their poster boys. It doesn't help him either.
Can I just say that I feel like 95% of fans don't care about this at all. Like, I think most people who watch Bellator.
Well, that's a bigger problem for
Well, I'm saying,
a
but
different day.
Bellator's ratings have been okay.
Sure.
Right? Their season ratings have been okay. They've been pretty decent. But I would BS the 95% of people.
But do they not care because they're indifferent?
They don't care
That's what
about
I'm
who.
saying.
They don't care how the fight gets made as long as the fight's there.
Yeah.
But is it because they care about Kern and Strauss? I'm talking about the bigger picture of what they're selling. They're selling
I'm saying
something that's not true at this
is a
point.
controversy, but it's maybe not to the people.
But that's a
who are
discussion about
consuming
where
their product.
Bellator is right now in the landscape, right?
Right.
No one really cares about the fact that Will Brooks won the lightweight tournament. He's not fighting Eddie Alvarez, right? No one cares about
but
that.
it might, the issue, and I think maybe it's jumping off of what Mike's saying, is that we're discussing, well, it's not fair, this is whatever. The fact is that there's going to be a title fight, and we're talking about it way in advance of it, so that's a good thing for Bellator. But from the perspective of fighters, if I'm an up-and-coming fighter and Bellator wants to sign me and they want to stick me in a tournament, I'm going to maybe say, well, I don't want to go into the tournament.
Sure.
I just want to take fights. And I'll get a title shot some other way.
Because that is hard to do, and they book these guys within a month of each thing. You know, it is a hard tournament to do. And then if you navigate it and you have the belief that you're doing it for a reason, there's a pot of gold at the end of it that you're going. And then you don't get it. That becomes something completely
When you're looking at this issue, you can look at it from the fan side, you can look at it from the promoter side, and you can look at it from the
Fighters.
From the fighter side.
Yeah.
Who am I forgetting? Of course, the fighters. So for each of them, it's a totally different story. As far as what's important and what's not. And the guys who are going through the tournament, they call it the toughest tournament in sports. Okay, that's obviously up for debate, but it is difficult. Like you said, you might fight a 3-round war. You got to get back in there in a month and a half from now. That is a difficult thing to do, and the pot at the end of the rainbow should be there when it's promised to you.
Right. Otherwise, it becomes the most meaningless tournament in sports, or the most irrelevant tournament in sports, or the tournament that leads to nothing. I mean, that's the catchphrase will be altered. So I think you're right. It doesn't matter, or you're right. It doesn't matter to fans, and we're discussing because we discuss these kinds of things and we sort of oversee that stuff, and that's what we do. But you're right. It's not the end of the world for any of us or the fans, but for the fighters, that's really the bottom line.
You're 100% right, and I think at the end of the day, Pitbull will get his title shot if he remains with Bellator. Who knows how this turns out? It's just more bad press for them. The Alvarez situation didn't help them as far as public perception. It's this thing that I keep talking about. You see media members and fans, they root for Invicta. You see them rooting. Right. They rooted for Scott Coker and Strikeforce. You felt it, right? They wanted them to succeed. You don't see that with Bellator. In fact, you always see people trying to bring up their faults or celebrate their mistakes or really kind of magnify them. And maybe we're doing that right here, but it's just more bad press. It's like they're viewed as the scummy promoter. Look at them screwing Pitbull. Look at them screwing Eddie Alvarez. That's what the big picture is here. Why do they not generate the same kind of, go get them that Scott Coker did, that Invicta does, that, we see now with Glory to a degree. You know what I'm saying? Usually the new kid or the one who's trying to challenge the UFC generates that.
Originally,
and
there
not.
was a little bit of that with Bellator.
I never really felt it.
Yeah, I would say that they, people were sort of wanting to push. I don't know. That was just a sense I had that they were sort of intrigued by it originally when it was on Deporte. It was all the things. But it's just, I don't know if it's just how if it's the tournament or if it's just Bjorn Rebney, like something about him. Whatever it is, I don't know. But,
no one wants to feel like the promoter is screwing the fighters, and they don't want to root for that.
What's worse, though, than people being almost negative and putting negative energy on it is indifference. And I feel like that's where they move into the space of indifference, and it becomes, what's the point of the whole thing?
And then, of course, then it brings up the issue of having too many shows, and it's all kind of blended into each other. So we'll see how it turns out. Their next season starts in just a few weeks. Okay, let us talk also about Keith Kizer. On Friday, kind of out of the blue, even though it had been sort of discussed and maybe, some people campaigned for this, he decided that he was going to step down as executive director in the Nevada Athletic Commission. That is effective January 27th, so he still has a few more days on the job to ruffle some feathers. Maybe there's a fight that Mazzagatti can referee in the next week or so. Who knows if he'll have a job come January 27th.
No fights on the slate for the rest of the month.
That is good. So my question is, what is Keith Kizer's legacy? He took over for Mark Ratner. Mark Ratner, beloved in the world of combat sports, boxing, and mixed martial arts, now works for the UFC. In many ways, this man, he's in the Nevada Hall of Fame. I mean, he was loved in Nevada. Kizer, not the same. What's his legacy at the end of the day as commissioner of the most powerful commission in the combat sports?
Okay, we've had this conversation before, right? That not everyone has a legacy.
Sure.
Not everyone deserves a legacy. I don't know that he has one.
He doesn't?
I don't know. I mean, certainly he'll be remembered for certain things by people who followed boxing and MMA. Some of them good, some of them not so good.
Do you give him a passing grade as commissioner?
Geez, that's a tough one. I don't know. Certainly he could have done. Nevada's the most influential commission in the United States, right? I mean, they have more MMA and at least high-profile MMA and boxing than any other state in the country. So a lot of times what they do is sort of the blueprint for how the rest of the country
Sure, they're the leader.
Or at least it's something that everyone else is going to look at. What could he have done more of? Certainly, he did play a role in increasing drug testing to a certain extent.
Right.
To a certain extent. He certainly could have gone further. We've seen recently with the Travis Brown, Josh Burnett, them doing enhanced drug testing out of competition. The promotion has to pay for it, but at least it's a step in the right direction. Mm-hmm. I believe that was the first time it's done. Obviously, they also busted Overeem in an out of competition test. Fortunately for them, it was when he flew himself into town, not knowing what was going on. It's not something that they've been able to, they can do across straight lines, and that's a limiting factor. But he certainly could have done a little bit more in terms of pushing random testing or out of competition testing. I think that's the thing that probably will sort of be looked at as a criticism for him. The thing with the referees and the judges and Big John McCarthy and all that, okay, wherever you go, you're going to have bad. You're going to have some bad decisions.
What about the fact that
judges.
guys would make mistakes, judges would make mistakes, and then it was never rectified? It almost seemed like his ego got the best of him. That the more it was, the more people complained, the more Dana White complained, he put those guys in big fights, those women in big fights. That to me was his biggest issue. He never evolved with times, never looked at himself and said, okay, what am I doing wrong? What am I doing right? And he did it in boxing, he did it in MMA. And in MMA, guys, could get seriously hurt. And look at the Berkman situation with John Fitch. Next show, Mazzagati's there. I mean, there was never any accountability for anyone's actions.
Well, you talk about things becoming high profile and all that, and really what was evolving, and what was evolving was not necessarily Keith Kizer, but the sport, the sporting landscape around him. When he started, it was boxing and this little sport MMA that was started to grow, but in the years that he's been there, MMA has become a major force. And how has he kind of navigated that landscape? Has he? I mean, he's gone with some of the same judges that he has doing boxing, and these are people that don't necessarily know the sport that they're judging, and he hasn't done a lot to try to change that, to shift it in such a way that might get better judges. Referees we're always going to criticize referee calls. It's just a natural thing. But the whole John McCarthy thing was a big deal, because this is not just some guy. This is a guy who is considered one, if not the best referee in the business, one of the two best referees in the business, and he doesn't work at all at these Vegas cards because of a personality thing, and that's a bad look.
That would happen in any company anywhere in America. You badmouth the boss, you're not coming back.
But at the end of the day, his job was to ensure that the fighters were safe in there, and he wasn't doing that by not hiring John McCarthy.
It was almost like if it's one thing to not use constructive criticism, because I feel like people gave him plenty of criticism. Not all of it was attack mode criticism, but it was this defiance with criticism. It was like there was defiance always in the air. I felt like with his time with the Nevada Athletic Commission, it seemed like the louder the critics would get, the more he would be defiant and sort of defending those.
He is a lawyer by nature.
Right, and absolutely, but it's sort of meant. I know that Dana White probably got to the point where that's why he would increase his volume each time there was a problem. He would, it was just because he knew it was falling on deaf ears, essentially. So he was going to just make it a bigger issue with everybody else, because that's the only way you could go about it. My thing was always, I remember when I talked to him a couple times, out there in Nevada, and you would ask him, what is the repercussion for a guy who maybe blows a call, or a judge who does this or that? And he would always be like, well, we talked to him, but it never seemed like you mentioned, that there was real accountability in play. So I felt like that was the biggest criticism I would have in the end, is that it just didn't seem like, if there's always going to be human error, But there should be, on recurring things that happen, it should have been looked at and dealt with a little bit differently on his watch.
One caveat here, though, let's be careful, what we wish for here, right? Because a lot of people wanted Keith Kizer to go away. Who's the heir apparent? I mean, is there some obvious?
I think GSP.
You stole mine. You stole mine. I was going to end the show with that to tie it all together.
Oh, sorry.
GSP is setting it up. GSP is setting it up.
Okay, how about Mayhem Miller then?
No, my next choice was Chael Sonnen, but GSP is the perfect choice.
Yeah, but that is a serious issue because I actually talked to Keith Kizer right after he handed in his resignation, and he talked about the fact that he was basically groomed for this position by Mark Ratner when Mark Ratner was still there, and he knew he was going to be leaving the company at some point in the near future. Keith Kizer has not been grooming anybody. There's nobody in the wings.
Is that another of his?
And I don't know if that's a good or bad thing.
Yeah.
But there's nobody in the pipeline there that's taking over the job that's been groomed for it. And have we heard of any great candidates from around the country who are interested in the job?
People love Andy Foster, but he just left Georgia to go to California. I don't see that happening. Names like Nick Lembo have been mentioned, but I don't see these guys leaving. It's going to be very interesting to see who comes in there because it is really the most powerful position or one of the most powerful positions in combat sports. Also, not so high paying. So you kind of sometimes get what you pay for.
And think about the skills that are involved. It's not just knowing how to deal with your referees and your judges and administering the drug test and other things that have to happen. But you also have to deal with the egos. I mean, you've got Dana White in one ear. You've got boxing promoters like Bob Arum and these other guys and the other, and you've got to be able to manage all that. And that it's not. So I think that as you said, how are we going to judge? We're going to judge Keith Kizer. We can't judge him now. We've got to judge him based on how he is compared to the guy who follows, the man or woman who follows.
By the way, not so well paying of a job, and also to be fair, if we're going to be critical of him, he started at a time when the economy was great. The economy took a dump. To be fair, in the last few years, budgets went down quite a bit. So all this stuff we're saying he could have done and would have done.
Sure.
I mean, certainly that impacted his ability to.
It's going to be interesting to see who they hire.
He had more wiggle room in with his finances than Mark Ratner did, though. Ratner was playing with a lot less, and he was able to accomplish what he did.
All right, that does it for us. Thank you so much for watching. Of course, let us know what you think about anything we talked about on today's show, and want to let you know that we're off for the next 2 weeks due to a couple of UFCs, one in Chicago and then very close to here in Newark, New Jersey. But we'll be back in a couple of weeks with a brand new episode of the MMA Beat. For Mike, Jeff, Chuck, I'm Ariel. Thank you so much for watching the Mixed Martial Arts Beat right here on MMAfighting.com.